We're going to move on now to industrial labor. We've looked at the captains of industry, in that era sometimes called the robber barons. Now we're going to look at the workers who actually worked in the factories and the mines and so forth. So, first question under industrial labor: how did um, the rise of big business and the Industrial Revolution in general affect working class people? It goes both ways. There are positives, there are negatives. We'll start with the positives since we'll be spending most of the time on the negatives and what they did about it. Um, but what industrial revolutions do, what they do is make it possible to produce significantly increased quantities of merchandise and market them at lower prices. That spells a general rise in the standard of living, which working class people were beneficiaries of that. Now, there were some very bad parts of it for them, but um, manufactured goods became far more readily available and far cheaper. So there is a general rise in the standard of living, even among factory workers who appear to be exploited. Um, on the other hand, the downside of it is that and industrial laborers, however they're defined, and that's very dynamic as that time goes by, they they suffer a loss of security and they suffer a loss of status. And our poster child here will be the shoemaking industry. It's just too good an example. Things like this are happening across the board. Okay, as late as the early 19th century, shoes are crafted by craftsmen called shoemakers. I used to think that cobblers were shoemakers. That was not correct. Cobblers are shoe repairmen. Well, so if you happen to be a shoemaker, you've got a secure position here because you had to start as an apprentice, and it would take on average about 10 years for an apprentice to learn this craft to get to where he could sit at his workbench and make a pair of shoes from start to finish, raw material to finished product. So you're not likely to have any sudden increase in supply driving your income down. And at first, you may be what's called a journeyman. You're working in some master craftsman shop. You get good at it, you could hang up your own sign and be a master craftsman. If you're really at the top, wealthy, famous people could come from many miles around to have shoes made by you and brag to their friends about it. So you have the satisfaction that comes from being able to do something really well. You have a decent income. People are always going to need shoes. I mean, you're not the rich guy, you're not the squire of the county, but it's a good place to be. And workplaces, there are relatively few people there. If you can't get along with the other shoemakers, hey, you just go somewhere else. So that looks like a good situation. And then I don't know just when, but as the 19th century rolls along, we start to see shoe factories. Don't get the wrong idea. I'm not talking industrial equipment or smokestacks or anything like that. The first shoe factory would have been when some entrepreneur got over a big old warehouse of some kind, hired as many shoemakers as he could hire. They're probably not the best ones. Get them in there and arrange them, organize them into a division of labor assembly line. So it takes the skill of a shoemaker to work there, but you're no longer going from start to finish. You no longer have the pride, the personal investment in the product. You're cutting out soles all day, or heels, or uppers, or stitching them together, slapping the heels on there. You're doing the same thing over and over again. Because for whatever reason, you would find that 20 shoemakers organized that way could make more shoes that way than they could working as individuals. So now for the remaining independent shoemakers, you start to see an increase in supply. The same number of shoemakers can make more shoes. No, they're not as good, but they're cheaper. And there've been people just making their own shoes who can now afford to buy them. So decade by decade, this continues till the latter part of the century when it's much more modern shoe factories with industrial equipment cutting out the parts of the shoe and industrial equipment putting them together. So whereas early in the century, shoes were made by skilled craftsmen who have pride and ownership of the product, by the end of the century, they're being made by unskilled or semi skilled machine operators who are paid much less, have no investment in the process, and have to just take what they can get. So that's overall what happens to industrial labor. Now, factory conditions. We start to see factories in the United States about the second decade of the century, and the factory system spreads rapidly, primarily in New England. At first, it's mainly textiles, textile-related things, cloth, uh, and then it's going to go on to one early big one was firearms. Samuel Colt invents a 5-shot revolver, and everybody wants one. So only a modern industrial setup could produce those. It just keeps spreading and spreading. But what were conditions like in the factories? Not so good. Fortunately, it doesn't get that hot in the summer up there, but forget about it being heated in the winter. The hours are incredibly long. If you're unskilled, you get up before the sun does and drag your body to the mill and work all day around dangerous equipment. They might let you off a few minutes to have lunch. You just have to go to the bathroom on the sly, and they don't have bathrooms. Figure it out. And maybe drag your tired body home again after dark. So it's not good. And it's not just men working there, it's women and children and whole families worked in factories. Well, when did they learn to read? They don't need to learn to read to work in a factory, of course. There you go. Without education, you are stuck. You ain't going anywhere. So you have all that. Child labor. Um, so pay is low, hours are long, and industrial concerns tend to be owned by individuals or families, and it can be a very, very frustrating situation. Now, if I were in a classroom, I would ask you how workers, what suggestion would you make? How could workers gain some control over the workplace? And somebody say, well, go on strike. I say, well, yeah, but you don't do that until you've organized. So basically, they get organized. Workers get organized. And since we're talking about just the textile industry at first, around Massachusetts mainly, that was illegal. It wasn't a legislative law, it was a judge made law, but the courts had ruled that labor unions were illegal attempts, conspiracies on the part of the factory workers to deprive the factory owner of the free use of his private property. So I'm the factory owner, and you see this place, this building, floor, machines, that is my stuff. And there's no way any of you or all you put together is going to tell me what to do with my stuff. So I'll see you later. Back so soon. Actually, I had the end of railroads and industry, and then it went straight on into industrial labor, and I decided to split those out so the titles wouldn't be such a mess. So, taking up where we left off, the official viewpoint was the factory was the private property of the owner, and the private property was protected. So that was tough. I wanted to speak to the issue of pay. Before I'm through, I said pay was low. Pay was set strictly by supply and demand. All right. And economists, if there were any, and factory owners believed in what was known as the iron law of wages. The iron law of wages meant that supply and demand alone set the wage for unskilled labor. So that meant what it averaged out to all too often was that the wage was the minimum necessary to keep the worker alive until the next day. Because since you have more hungry people wanting work than there is work available, that will be a kind of reverse meat market which bids wages down to the lowest point, to that whatever the lowest point is, whoever would work for the least would get the job. And why would you, if it's not enough to keep you alive, well, hey, you can go out in the park, lean up against a tree, and die there. You don't have to die in a stinking factory. So wages tend to be bid down. Okay, so, but when it came to organizing, picking up some loose ends into unions, obviously skilled workers could get by with that. They could get away with it even if it was illegal. Unskilled workers, forget it. They're way too easy to replace. There aren't unions of unskilled workers even to this day. There are industrial unions which will include them, but I don't know of any unions of unskilled workers. Okay, so if I'm the factory owner and the skilled people that I have to pay more to get and they're hard to replace, they form their little club. And one of them comes in to talk to me. I might not be saying the nicest things, but I got to deal with them because I can't just go out and replace them like I can the unskilled. Okay. The iron law of wages, and I may come back to this in another connection later, but just in case, that the problem as the 19th century drew to a close with immigration running very high and no particular controls on it at all, the problem was not so much the greed of the factory owners as it was an oversupplied labor force. The labor force was glutted. More and more people coming in all the time. They're desperate for work. They're bidding wages down. As a result, by the way, precisely the same economic rules apply at all times and all places. So if we opened up free immigration, that would hit low-paid workers the hardest because it would drive wages down. It's just how it is. Can't be nice about it. So what this did was to spread the available work out over the largest number of people. Okay? You'd say, well, the solution to that, let's have a minimum wage. That is popular, but doesn't work very well because employers, all the way from factory owners to fast food store owners, they got so much they can spend on wages. And if the government comes out and commands them to raise the minimum wage, they can't afford as many workers as they could before. So the workers they keep around will make more money, and the workers they can't afford anymore will just be gone. And not everyone will get the pay increase. Plus, any economist can tell you that it's going to equal out in about 6 months to a year. The inflation that will result, because it's not just the bottom workers that go up, it kicks the whole wage scale up, and that's inflation. And it's all going to equal out. Purchasing power will be back where it was before. And the people that are hurt then will be people on fixed incomes. So the more you know about economics, the more the stuff spouted by politicians sounds like gibberish. To me, it does. Okay. So, I'm going to go ahead and finish this, and the next video will have to do with organizing. I'll go ahead and tell you that with skilled workers could organize, and by the 1850s, skilled workers in factories commonly were organized because they could get away with it. In fact, the highest court in Massachusetts changed its mind in 1842 and ruled that workers could organize as long as the union didn't do anything illegal. Of course, anything they might think about doing probably would be illegal. But through the end of after the Civil War, there was no such thing as a national scale labor organization. And that's where we're going to pick it up next time.